In the heart of London, Elias Thorne was the most feared name on the streets, a king of the underworld who ruled with iron and ice. But there was one thing even his deadliest enemies couldn't understand. For 7 long years, he never touched a woman. Not out of lack of desire, but because of a dark, blood-stained vow that turned his skin into a prison. They called him the Ghost, a man who lived in a tomb of his own making, until a face from his past arrived to shatter the ice. This is the story of a man who sacrificed everything to keep a secret, and the woman who taught him that true strength is the courage to be touched. Witness a journey of raw power, hidden guilt, and the ultimate redemption. The sky over the city was the color of a bruised lung, heavy with the threat of a downpour that had been lingering since October 14, 2022. In the heart of the East End, where the Victorian brickwork seemed to sweat with the secrets of 1,000 crimes, Elias Thorne stood by the window of his penthouse. He was 34 years old, a man built like a monument to hard lessons and even harder choices. His shoulders were broad, stretching the fabric of a charcoal suit that cost more than most men in this neighborhood earned in a year. His face was a map of sharp angles and old scars, dominated by eyes the color of flint, eyes that had seen the light leave a man's soul too many times to ever be truly soft again. Below him, the pulse of the city hummed, a frantic neon heartbeat that he controlled with a flick of his wrist and a whisper in the right ears. Elias was the undisputed king of these streets, a man feared for his silence as much as his violence. But within the gilded cage of his empire, there was a whisper that carried more weight than his ledger of debts. They called him the Ghost of the East End, not because he was invisible, but because he lived like a man already dead to the pleasures of the flesh. It had been years since he had allowed the warmth of a woman's skin to press against his own. In a world fueled by excess, where power was usually measured by the beauty of the women on a man's arm, Elias's abstinence was a glaring anomaly. It was a riddle that bothered his enemies and unsettled his allies. They assumed it was a quirk, a strange psychological byproduct of his rise to the top, but they were wrong. Every second of his isolation was a calculated, agonizing choice. The heavy oak door to his office groaned open, and Arthur, his oldest lieutenant, stepped inside. Arthur was 60, a relic of a more brutal era, with hands like gnarled roots and a loyalty that was beyond question. He looked at Elias, who remained motionless by the window, watching the rain finally begin to smear the glass. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound like gravel shifting in a pan. He mentioned that the meeting with the Italians was set for later that evening at the club. He noted that they were bringing a gift as a gesture of goodwill, a term everyone in their world understood to mean a woman selected for her beauty and her ability to extract secrets from powerful men. Elias didn't turn around. He simply watched a single droplet of water race down the pane, feeling the coldness of the glass through the layers of his suit. The club was a subterranean labyrinth of velvet, smoke, and the heavy scent of expensive gin. When Elias walked in, the music didn't stop, but the atmosphere shifted, the air turning thick with a sudden sharp tension. He sat in the corner booth, the shadows swallowing most of his form, leaving only the glint of his gold watch visible. The Italians arrived, led by a man named Marco, who smiled too much and smelled of too much cologne. After the business was discussed, territories carved up like Sunday roasts, Marco signaled to the back. A woman stepped forward. Her name was Eleanor. She was a vision of liquid gold in a silk dress that clung to every curve of her body like a second skin. Her hair was a dark cascade over her shoulders, and her eyes were wide, predatory, and inviting all at once. Marco whispered something about hospitality and stepped back, leaving Eleanor to slide into the booth next to Elias. The proximity was immediate and overwhelming. Elias could smell the jasmine on her neck, a scent that triggered a visceral primal memory he had fought to bury for 7 long years. She leaned in, her voice a low purr that vibrated against his ear. She told him she had heard he was a man of discipline, but that every man had a breaking point. She reached out, her fingers tapering into crimson nails, and let them hover just an inch above the back of his hand. Elias felt the heat radiating from her skin, a magnetic pull that made the muscles in his jaw ache with the effort of remaining still. The air between them seemed to ionize, charged with a desperate, unspoken hunger. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a funeral drum in his own ears. Elena's hand moved closer, her fingertips finally making feather-light contact with the hair on his wrist. It was a touch that should have been nothing, yet it felt like a bolt of electricity jolting through his entire nervous system. In that split second, the room faded. He wasn't in a club. He was back in a rain-slicked alleyway, the iron tang of blood filling his nose, the sound of a fading heartbeat echoing in the silence. The trauma of his past surged up like a black tide, threatening to drown the present. He saw a face he hadn't allowed himself to picture in 1,000 nights, and the guilt hit him with the force of a physical blow. Elias pulled his hand away, as if he had been burned by molten lead. His movement was so sudden, so violent, that Elena recoiled, her eyes wide with genuine shock. The silence in the booth was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the surrounding party. He looked at her, his flint-grey eyes cold and murderous, hiding the raw agony that was tearing through his chest. He told her to get out. His voice was a rasp, a sound stripped of all humanity. Marco started to protest, his smile faltering, but Arthur stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on the hilt of the blade tucked into his waistband. The Italians left quickly, sensing that they had poked a sleeping lion that was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Once they were gone, Elias remained in the booth, his hands shaking so violently he had to clench them into fists. He looked at his wrist, where the ghost of Elena's touch still seemed to linger like a brand. He felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made him nauseous. Every year of his vow, every day of his penance, felt like it was hanging by a thread. He stood up and walked out of the club, ignoring the stares, ignoring the whispers that would undoubtedly grow louder by morning. He walked into the cold London night, letting the rain soak through his expensive suit, hoping the chill would numb the fire in his blood. He reached the edge of the Thames, the water black and churning like his own thoughts. He pulled a small silver locket from his pocket, a piece of jewelry he never wore but always carried. He didn't open it. He couldn't. Instead, he gripped it so hard the metal bit into his palm, drawing a tiny drop of blood. He whispered a name into the wind, a name that was the key to his prison and the anchor to his soul. As he stood there, a shadow detached itself from the pillars of the bridge nearby. A man he didn't recognize, dressed in the drab clothes of a common laborer, approached him with a cautious gait. The man didn't look like a hitman, but in this city, death often wore the most unremarkable faces. The stranger stopped 10 feet away, his breath hitching in the damp air. He said he had a message from someone who had been watching him, someone who knew why he didn't touch the world anymore. Elias turned, his hand moving toward his holster, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the man's face for a threat. But the stranger didn't move to attack. He simply held out a crumpled piece of paper, his hand trembling. He told Elias that the time for hiding behind the vow was coming to an end, and that the past was no longer content to stay buried. Before Elias could demand answers, the man turned and vanished into the fog, leaving Elias alone with a new weight in his pocket and a cold realization that the secret he had guarded for so long was no longer his alone. The memory didn't come in pieces. It hit him like a physical tide, cold and relentless, dragging him back to August 3rd, 2015. Back then, the air in London hadn't felt quite so heavy, or perhaps Elias had simply been too young and too arrogant to notice the weight of the sky. At 27, he wasn't a king yet. He was a prince of the pavement, a rising storm in the East End hierarchy. He was reckless, driven by a hunger that transcended money, and he had Sarah. Sarah was the only piece of his world that wasn't stained by the soot of the docks or the grease of the gambling dens. She was a weaver of light, a woman whose laughter could silence the roar of the city traffic. Their apartment in Bethnal Green was a sanctuary of peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture, but to Elias it was a palace. That evening, the humidity had been stifling, a thick blanket that made their skin glisten under the dim yellow glow of a single overhead bulb. He remembered the way she looked, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair a wild halo of chestnut curls. She had been wearing one of his oversized white shirts, the fabric translucent against the smooth tan skin of her shoulders. The air was filled with the scent of rain-dampened earth and the cheap, sweet tobacco he smoked back then. Elias moved toward her, his movements fluid and filled with a raw, unchecked desire. There had been no barriers then, no walls of ice. He sat behind her, his large, calloused hands coming to rest on her waist. The contrast was stark, his knuckles scarred from a dozen street fights pressing against the delicate, yielding softness of her ribs. He leaned forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin, which always reminded him of vanilla and sunshine. She leaned back into him, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she tilted her head to give him better access. His lips traced the line of her throat, his touch deliberate and worshipful. He felt the rapid, rhythmic thrum of her pulse against his mouth, a vibrant reminder of the life he held in his hands. Every graze of his fingertips along her collarbone sent a jolt of electricity through him, a connection so profound it felt as though their very souls were intertwining. They had spent hours that night in a slow, heated dance of discovery, their bodies communicating in a language that bypassed the need for words. It was a physical intimacy that was both explosive and tender, a celebration of a love that felt invincible. Elias had believed, with the foolish certainty of youth, that he could protect this warmth from the cold reality of his profession. But the world Elias lived in didn't allow for sanctuaries. His rise had made enemies, and those enemies didn't care about the sanctity of a bedroom. 3 hours after they had shared that quiet, sensual peace, the door to their sanctuary was kicked open. The violence was instantaneous and chaotic. Shadowy figures flooded the room, the flashes of gunfire illuminating the peeling wallpaper like a strobe light. Elias had reached for his weapon, his instincts taking over, but he had been a fraction of a second too slow. A stray round meant for his chest had found a different mark. The silence that followed the gunshots was louder than the noise. Elias had cleared the room, his heart a frozen lump in his throat, before he turned back to the bed. Sarah was slumped against the headboard, the white shirt he loved now blossoming with a terrifying crimson flower. The heat of the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a crystalline, soul-crushing cold. He scooped her into his arms, his hands, which had been so gentle just hours before, now frantic as he tried to stem the flow of her life. He carried her to a hidden clinic, a place where questions weren't asked, but the surgeon's eyes told him everything he needed to know before the man even spoke. He was allowed 10 minutes alone with her in a room that smelled of antiseptic and despair. Sarah's face was pale, the light in her eyes flickering like a candle in a gale. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched his cheek, leaving a faint smear of red on his skin. She whispered his name, her voice a fragile thread. She didn't ask for revenge, and she didn't curse the men who had done this. Instead, she looked at him with a clarity that haunted him every night since. She told him that his hands were made for war, and that as long as he stayed in that world, everything he touched would eventually turn to ash. She made him promise with her final ragged breaths that he would never let another woman suffer because of the darkness he carried. She made him swear that he would never love again, never share his life or his bed with anyone else, so that no one else would ever have to pay the price for his sins. In that moment of absolute, shattering grief, Elias Thorne didn't just make a promise. He forged a blood pact with the ghost of the woman he had loved. He pressed his forehead against hers, the warmth fading from her skin, and whispered the vow that would become his prison. He swore that he would remain untouched, a man apart until the day he was no longer a part of the world that had killed her. He kissed her one last time, a cold, final contact that sealed the door to his heart. When he walked out of that clinic on the morning of August 4th, 2015, the reckless prince was gone. In his place was a man of iron and ice. He spent the next several years systematically destroying every person involved in that night, building an empire on the ruins of his own happiness. He became a king, but he was a king who lived in a desert. Every time he felt the stirrings of desire, every time a woman like Elena tried to tempt him, the memory of Sarah's dying words acted like a lash, reminding him of the cost of his touch. Back in the present, on that rainy October night in 2022, Elias stood by the Thames, the locket still biting into his palm. The stranger's note was crumpled in his other hand. The physical ache in his body, The hunger he had suppressed for over 7 years was a constant low-grade fever. He looked down at the paper. It contained only a name and an address in a part of London he hadn't visited in years. The name was Clara. Clara. The name stirred a different kind of memory, one from a time even before Sarah. She had been the girl from the neighborhood, the one who had seen him before he became a monster. He hadn't thought of her in a decade, and now someone was using her name to draw him out. The vow was his shield, but as he stared at the dark water, Elias realized that a shield could also be a tomb. The past was no longer a memory. It was a hunter, and it had found a way to bypass his walls. He knew he had to go to that address, not just to protect the secret of his vow, but to see if any part of the man who had loved Sarah still existed beneath the ice. The spring of 2023 brought no warmth to the city of London. Instead, May 21st was a day of relentless silver drizzle that turned the limestone buildings into weeping monuments. Elias Thorne pulled his vintage sedan to a stop in front of a tenement block that the world seemed to have forgotten. The architecture here was a brutalist nightmare of grey concrete and rusted iron railings, a stark contrast to the glass and steel towers he now commanded. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic growl. In his hand, the crumpled note felt like a live wire. He stepped out, the damp air instantly clinging to his wool coat. He didn't look like a king here. He looked like a predator, returning to the ruins of his birth. He climbed the stairs, the sound of his leather soles echoing against the cracked tiles. On the 4th floor, he stopped in front of door number 42. He hesitated, his heart performing a slow, heavy roll in his chest. For 7 years, he had operated on logic and violence. Now he was moving on a ghost of a feeling. He knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman who seemed to be made of shadows and soft edges. Clara. She was 31 now, but her face still held the echoes of the girl who used to steal apples from the market with him when they were 12. Her hair was a deep, honeyed blonde, pulled back in a loose, messy knot that left stray strands framing a face that was beautiful in its exhaustion. Her eyes, a startling clear green, widened as they landed on him. She didn't scream or slam the door. She simply exhaled a name he hadn't heard spoken with such tenderness in a decade. Elias entered the apartment, his presence immediately shrinking the small, cluttered space. The room smelled of lavender and stale tea, a domestic scent that felt foreign and dangerous to a man like him. Clara stood by the small kitchenette, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric of her faded denim jeans. She was thinner than he remembered, the delicate line of her collarbone visible beneath a soft, oversized sweater. The silence between them was thick, a living thing that pulsed with the weight of 10 years of absence and the secret Elias carried like a lead weight in his stomach. She walked toward him, her movements hesitant. As she got closer, the heat radiating from her body began to bridge the gap between them. Elias felt his pulse quicken, a familiar agonizing tightness constriction his throat. He remained a statue, his hands forced deep into his coat pockets to prevent them from reaching out. He watched the way her chest rose and fell, the rhythmic movement of her breathing drawing his eyes to the soft curve of her neck. The physical pull was magnetic, a primal force that ignored the iron walls he had built around his soul. Clara stopped just 2 feet away. She reached out, her hand hovering in the air between them, much like the woman at the club had done. But this was different. There was no artifice here, only a raw, aching need for connection. She whispered that she hadn't known if he would come, that she didn't know who else to turn to. She told him that she was being hunted by men who didn't care about the rules of the street, men who wanted something her late brother had hidden away. As she spoke, she moved half a step closer. The scent of her, something like rain and warm skin, swirled around him. Elias felt the sweat break out on the back of his neck, despite the chill in the room. His mind was screaming at him to turn away, to remember the blood on the white shirt, to remember the vow. But his body was betraying him. He could see the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes, and the urge to brush them away with his thumb was so intense it was a physical pain. He could imagine the softness of her cheek, the way her skin would yield under his touch. She finally let her hand drop, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his coat. Even through the thick wool, the contact felt like a brand. Elias flinched, a sharp, jagged movement that made Clara recoil. Her expression shifted from hope to a profound, confused hurt. She asked him why he looked at her like she was a monster, why he wouldn't even look at her hands. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. How could he explain that his touch was a curse? How could he tell her that he was protecting her by staying cold? The tension in the room reached a breaking point. The physical proximity was becoming a form of torture. He could see the pulse jumping in her neck, inviting a kiss that he had sworn never to give. The air between them felt charged, heavy with the electricity of a storm that refused to break. He realized then that Clara wasn't just a girl from his past. She was the ultimate test of his penance. She represented everything he had sacrificed and everything he still secretly craved. Before the silence could swallow them both, a sharp metallic sound erupted from the hallway outside. The distinct click of a handgun's safety being disengaged. The world of shadows had followed him here. Elias's instincts slammed back into place, the ice of the gangster overriding the heat of the man. He grabbed Clara by the arm, his grip firm and utilitarian, devoid of the tenderness he felt, and pulled her toward the back bedroom. The touch was brief, a mere second of contact, but it sent a shockwave through him that nearly buckled his knees. As they crouched in the darkness of the small room, the front door was kicked open with a violent crash. Heavy footsteps thudded across the floorboards. Elias drew his own weapon, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light beneath the bedroom door. He felt Clara's breath against his ear, her body pressed against his side in the cramped space. Every point of contact was a siren song, a reminder of what it felt like to be alive, to be human. But as the shadows of the gunmen moved across the living room, Elias knew that the night was only beginning, and the true danger wasn't the men with guns, but the woman trembling in his arms. The transition from the cramped bedroom to the rain-slicked labyrinth of the city was a blur of adrenaline and muffled violence. Elias had moved with the lethal efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life dancing on the edge of a blade. 2 men had fallen in the hallway, not by the roar of gunfire, which would have drawn unwanted attention, but by the silent, crushing precision of Elias's hands. He had kept Clara behind him, his body a living shield, feeling the frantic heat of her breath against his spine. They had reached the sedan just as the first sirens began to wail in the distance, a mournful sound that echoed through the concrete canyons. By the time they reached the safe house, the city was draped in the deepest shadows of the night. It was May 22nd, 2023. The location was a forgotten loft in a derelict industrial district, a place where the air tasted of iron and ancient dust. Inside, the space was cavernous, illuminated only by the rhythmic amber flash of a faulty street lamp outside. Elias didn't turn on the lights. He knew that light was a luxury they couldn't afford, and darkness was the only veil that could hide the cracks forming in his resolve. Clara collapsed onto a threadbare velvet sofa, her chest heaving as the shock finally began to settle in. Elias stood by the heavy steel door, his ears tuned to the silence of the street. He shed his overcoat, his movements stiff. The silence in the loft was heavy, thick with the unsaid words that had been accumulating for a decade. He could feel her gaze on him, a weight that felt more substantial than the weapon tucked into his waistband. He finally turned to face her. She was shivering, though the night was humid. Her oversized sweater had slipped off one shoulder, revealing the creamy, pale curve of her skin. In the flickering amber light, she looked like a ghost from a dream he had tried to forget. Elias walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the cold floorboards. He needed to ensure she wasn't hurt, but the prospect of intentional physical contact made his blood run hot and cold at the same time. He knelt in front of her, the distance between them shrinking until he could feel the warmth radiating from her knees. He asked her if she had been hit. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the small space between them. Clara shook her head, but her hands were trembling so violently she couldn't still them. Without thinking, Elias reached out to steady her. His large, scarred hands covered hers, and the impact of the contact was instantaneous. It wasn't the utilitarian grip from the apartment. This was skin on skin. The heat of her was a revelation, a sensory explosion that threatened to shatter his 7-year penance in a single heartbeat. Her skin was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the rough, callous textures of his own life. He felt the delicate bones of her fingers beneath his palms, and for a moment, the world outside, the gunmen, the debts, the blood, ceased to exist. There was only the rhythmic thumping of his own heart, and the electricity of her touch. Clara didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned forward, her face inches from his. He could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, the way her eyelashes cast long shadows against her cheeks. The scent of her, jasmine and something deeper, more intoxicating, filled his lungs. She whispered his name, and the sound was a caress that felt more intimate than any physical act. She moved her hand, sliding it up his arm, her fingertips tracing the hard line of his forearm. Every inch of progress she made was a new fire ignited under his skin. The tension in the loft was a physical presence, a coil wound so tight it was humming. Elias felt a desperate, primal urge to pull her against him, to bury his face in the hollow of her neck and let the world burn. He could imagine the weight of her body in his arms, the way her curves would fit against his sharp angles. The air between them was saturated with a decade of suppressed longing. He watched her lips, parted slightly as her breath hitched, and the memory of his vow felt like a distant, fading echo. But as her fingers reached his shoulder, the phantom image of a white shirt blossoming with red flashed across his mind. The cold, metallic taste of guilt flooded his mouth. He abruptly stood up, breaking the contact so suddenly that Clara let out a soft, wounded gasp. He turned his back to her, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of a heavy wooden table. His breath came in ragged, uneven bursts. He told her she should try to sleep, that he would be watching the door. Clara stood up, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. She asked him why he was doing this, why he treated her like she was made of glass or poison. She walked behind him, and though she didn't touch him, he could feel her proximity like a physical heat. She said she remembered the boy who used to jump fences with her, the boy who wasn't afraid to feel something. She asked him what had happened to change him into a man of stone. Elias didn't turn around. He couldn't risk looking at her, not when his skin still felt like it was on fire from her touch. He told her that the boy was dead and the man she saw was all that was left. He spoke of the world they were in, how every weakness was a target, and how he couldn't afford to have any. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were only half-truths. The real truth was buried under a layer of grief so deep, he was afraid that if he ever let it out, it would consume everything in its path. Across the city, in the sterile high-rise office of a rival syndicate, the events of the evening were being dissected. The men who had attacked the apartment had reported back. They spoke of Elias Thorne's ferocity, but more importantly, they spoke of the woman. For years, Elias had been an enigma, a man without a pressure point. Now they had found his Achilles heel. The word was spreading through the London underbelly. The ghost of the East End had finally found something he was willing to protect. Back in the loft, Elias watched as Clara eventually succumbed to exhaustion, curling up on the sofa under a heavy wool blanket he had provided. He sat in a chair by the window, the cold steel of his weapon a familiar weight in his lap. The rain continued to fall, a relentless grey curtain that veiled the city. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held hers only an hour ago. He could still feel the phantom warmth of her skin, a lingering sensation that made the isolation of his life feel more unbearable than ever before. He realized then that the safe house was a lie. There was no place in this city, or in this life, where they would truly be safe. His enemies wouldn't stop until they used Clara to break him, and his own heart wouldn't stop until it broke through the walls he had spent 7 years building. The shadows weren't just shifting outside the window, they were moving within him. And as the first light of dawn began to grey the horizon, Elias Thorne knew that the most dangerous battle was the one he was about to lose. The relative peace of the safe house was shattered on November 11th, 2023. It was a day when the London fog felt like a wet shroud, clinging to the skeletal remains of the industrial district. Elias had spent the morning cleaning his weapon, the rhythmic click of the metal components the only soundtrack to the heavy silence between him and Clara. They had lived in this limbo for weeks, a period of shared breaths and avoided glances. But the city was not done with Elias Thorne. and the bill for his isolation was finally coming due. The call came through on a burner phone, a short, frantic message from Arthur. One of Elias's primary distribution hubs near the docks was being systematically dismantled. It wasn't a standard raid, it was an execution. His men were being slaughtered, and his territory was being carved up by the very rivals who had sensed his new vulnerability. For 7 years, Elias had ruled through a reputation of untouchable coldness. Now the perception that he had a heart, no matter how buried, was an invitation to his downfall. Elias didn't call for reinforcements. He didn't order a strategic retreat. The fury that had been simmering beneath his skin since the night in the club finally boiled over. He left Clara with a single command to stay inside and lock the door, his eyes 2 shards of frozen flint. He drove toward the docks, the engine of his car screaming through the empty streets. When he arrived, the warehouse was a scene of calculated carnage. The air was thick with the scent of cordite and copper, the iron tang of blood staining the concrete floor. He moved through the shadows like a phantom, a detached killing machine. There was no hesitation in his movements, no flicker of emotion on his face as he neutralized the intruders. His lack of physical connection to the world had transformed him into something less than human, a weapon of pure, cold efficiency. He fought with a brutal, silent intensity. His hands, the same hands that had trembled when they touched Clara's, now dealing out a final, unforgiving judgment. By the time the last of the attackers lay still, Elias was covered in the soot of the struggle, his knuckles split and his heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. He returned to the loft as the grey light of late afternoon began to bleed through the clouds. He moved slowly, the adrenaline fading to leave a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. When he pushed open the steel door, he found Clara standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of the street lamp. She turned to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. She saw the blood on his shirt, the dark bruise blooming along his jaw, and the deadness in his gaze. She didn't stay back this time. She crossed the room with a determination that ignored his silent warning to keep his distance. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the collar of his jacket. Elias tried to pull away, his voice a low, warning growl, but she ignored him. She told him that she couldn't watch him do this anymore. She spoke of the man he was becoming, a ghost who walked among the living but refused to join them. She asked him if this was the price of his secret, if he was willing to let himself bleed out in the dark just to keep a promise to the dead. The argument that followed was a collision of 2 worlds. Elias spoke of duty, of the danger that followed him like a shadow, and the necessity of his walls. Clara countered with the reality of the present, the warmth of her breath hitching as she spoke. She told him that he was alive, whether he liked it or not, and that his pulse didn't care about his vows. She moved closer, her body a soft, persistent heat against the cold wall of his chest. She reached up, her hands cupping his face. Her skin was incredibly warm against the chill of his skin, a sensation so sharp it felt like a physical wound. Elias closed his eyes, his breath hitching as he fought the urge to lean into her touch. The scent of her, that intoxicating mix of jasmine and rain, filled his senses, clouding his judgment. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to take what she was offering, to let the fire of her presence burn away the ice of his past. Her thumbs traced the line of his jaw, lingering on the bruise with a tenderness that made his knees weak. The physical proximity was a torture of the highest order. He could feel the rapid, frantic thrum of her heart against his ribs, a rhythmic echo of his own desperation. She whispered that he didn't have to be alone, that the ghost of the woman he had loved wouldn't want him to live in a tomb. The words hit him like a physical blow, a direct strike to the guilt that had been his only companion for 7 years. He reached out, his hands grasping her waist with a sudden, rough intensity. He pulled her flush against him, the contact a desperate, jagged thing. He could feel every curve of her body through the thin fabric of her sweater, the suppleness of her waist, the firm pressure of her legs against his own. The air between them was gone, replaced by a shared, ragged heat. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his lips grazing her skin with a hunger that was terrifying in its depth. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but his breath was hot against her throat, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin of her shoulder. He felt her hands slide into his hair, pulling him closer, her body arching into his with a soft, melodic moan that shattered the last of his composure. In that moment, the warehouse, the rivals, and the blood pact felt like they belonged to a different man. There was only the weight of her in his arms, and the agonizing, beautiful realization that his touch was not a curse, but a lifeline he was drowning without. But even as his fingers began to slide beneath the hem of her sweater, feeling the incredible, silk-like smoothness of her back, the image of the silver locket flashed in his mind. The cold weight of his promise pulled at his soul, a heavy anchor in a rising tide of desire. He was hovering on the precipice of a betrayal he wasn't sure he could survive, and as Clara tilted her face up to his, her lips parted in an invitation that promised both salvation and ruin, Elias Thorne felt the very foundation of the man he had forced himself to become begin to crack. The air in the loft was thick enough to choke a man, heavy with the scent of rain, gunpowder, and the desperate electric heat of two bodies that had forgotten how to be apart. It was the early hours of November 12th, 2023. Elias stood there, his hands still anchored to Clara's waist, feeling the frantic, rhythmic pulse of her life beneath his palms. The silence was no longer empty. It was a pressurized chamber waiting for a single word to shatter the glass. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, he let his forehead rest against hers, his eyes closing as he inhaled the jasmine scent that had become his only oxygen. He told her, his voice a broken whisper, that he wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what he did to the things he loved. The confession felt like a physical weight leaving his chest, a jagged stone he had been swallowing for 7 long years. Clara didn't speak. She simply moved her hands from his face to the back of his neck, her fingers sliding into the dark hair at the nape of his neck. The contact was deliberate, a steadying force that kept him anchored in the present. She pulled him toward the small, flickering fire he had started in the hearth earlier that evening. They sat on the floor, the orange light casting long, dancing shadows across the brick walls, turning the derelict loft into a sanctuary of gold and velvet darkness. There, in the quiet glow of the embers, Elias finally told her the story of August 3rd, 2015. He spoke of Sarah, the white shirt, and the crimson flower that had bloomed on the bed. He described the coldness of the clinic and the weight of the promise he had made to a woman whose heart was stopping beneath his hands. As he spoke, the numbers of his penance, 2,654 days of isolation, seemed to carve themselves into the air. Clara listened with a stillness that was both haunting and healing. When he finished, his voice trailing off into the crackle of the wood, she didn't offer pity. She reached out and took his hand, her thumb tracing the scarred knuckles that had dealt so much death. She told him that a promise made in the shadow of death wasn't meant to be a life sentence. She said that Sarah wouldn't have wanted him to become a statue, but a man who remembered what it felt like to be warm. The emotional revelation broke a dam that had been holding back a decade of suppressed longing. Elias looked at her, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't see a potential victim or a test of his resolve. He saw a woman who knew the worst parts of him and hadn't looked away. He reached out, his hand trembling as he tucked a stray lock of honey-colored hair behind her ear. His fingertips grazed the sensitive skin of her temple, and the jolt of electricity that followed was so intense it made his breath hitch. He moved closer, his large frame casting a shadow over her. He began to explore the landscape of her face with a reverence that was almost painful. His thumbs traced the arch of her eyebrows, the curve of her cheekbones, and the soft, inviting line of her jaw. Every touch was a discovery, a reawakening of senses he thought had been cauterized. The heat between them was a living entity now, a slow-burning fire that demanded more than just proximity. Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as she let out a long, shaky exhale. She reached for the buttons of his shirt, her movement slow and deliberate. As the fabric fell away, revealing the map of scars and muscle that defined his torso, she let her palms rest against his chest. Elias felt the warmth of her hands over his heart, which was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The contrast between her soft, delicate skin and his rugged, battle-hardened frame was a visual and tactile symphony. The night became a slow, sensual exploration. He pulled her onto his lap, her legs wrapping around his waist as she pressed her chest against his. The physical contact was overwhelming, the pressure of her thighs, the weight of her breasts against his ribs, and the way her breath felt like a caress against his neck. He buried his face in the hollow of her throat, his lips grazing the skin with a hunger that was tempered by a newfound tenderness. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was a man rediscovering the language of touch. They spent hours in that golden half-light, their bodies moving in a slow rhythmic dance of intimacy. Elias described the feeling of her skin as liquid silk, the way her hair felt like spun gold between his fingers. He traced every curve and contour of her body, his hands lingering on the small of her back and the flare of her hips. It was a night of intense physical connection, yet he held back from the final, ultimate act of intimacy. The vow was still there, a thin, transparent barrier, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a choice he was slowly outgrowing. As the first hints of grey light began to touch the windows of the loft on the morning of November 13th, 2023, they were still entwined on the floor, covered by a heavy wool blanket. The fire had died down to a pile of glowing rubies. Elias watched Clara sleep, her face peaceful in the dawn. He realized that the secret he had guarded wasn't just about Sarah. It was about his own fear of being human. But the peace was a fragile thing. As he looked out at the waking city, he saw a black car idling at the end of the street, its headlights flickering once, then twice, a signal from Arthur. The bubble they had created was about to burst. The past had been revealed, and the emotional walls had crumbled, but the physical debt to the world of shadows still had to be paid. Elias Thorne knew that to keep the warmth he had found in the dark, he would have to face the cold one last time, and the price of his freedom would be higher than he ever imagined. The winter of 2024 arrived in London like a serrated blade, cutting through the city with a frost that turned the Thames into a dark, churning vein of ice. It was January 19th, 2024, a day where the sun remained a pale, distant memory behind a ceiling of leaden clouds. Elias Thorne stood on the roof of a derelict granary, his breath blooming in the air like ghostly flowers. He had spent the last 2 months living in the precarious balance between his old world and the new one Clara had offered him. He had protected her, moved her from one shadow to another, but the debt of his past was a bloodhound that never lost the scent. The signal from Arthur had been clear. The alliance of his rivals had finally coalesced into a single, lethal intent. They didn't want his territory anymore, they wanted his soul. They had lured Clara to this isolated stretch of the river, using a fragment of her brother's journals as bait, a ghost of a secret that didn't even exist. Elias looked down at the courtyard below, where several black SUVs were parked like predators in the snow. He felt the cold biting into his skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy focus that had settled over his mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. For 8 years it had been his anchor and his anchor. He looked at the tarnished metal, remembering the night Sarah's heart had stopped. For the first time, the memory didn't bring the crushing weight of guilt. It brought a strange, quiet clarity. He realized that his vow hadn't been an act of love. It had been an act of fear. He had been so afraid of losing again that he had stopped living altogether. He closed his eyes and summoned the sensation of Clara's skin from their night in the loft, the velvet heat of her waist, the silk-like texture of her back, and the jasmine scent that had replaced the smell of cordite in his lungs. That warmth was the only thing that was real. With a deliberate motion, Elias opened his hand and let the locket fall. He watched it disappear into the swirling grey mist of the river below, a final silent goodbye to the ghost of August 3rd, 2015. He was no longer a man bound by a promise to the dead. He was a man fighting for the living. He descended into the granary, his movements silent and lethal. The interior was a cavernous space of rusted machinery and rotting timber. He found Clara in the center of the main hall, her hands bound with heavy zip ties, her face pale but her eyes burning with a defiance that made his heart swell. Marco stood over her, his expensive coat out of place in the filth of the warehouse. He was smiling, a predatory expression that told Elias everything he needed to know about the man's intentions. The confrontation wasn't a cinematic duel, it was a desperate, ugly struggle for survival. Elias moved through the shadows, taking out Marco's men with a ferocity that was born of a decade of suppressed emotion. He didn't use his gun unless he had to. He wanted them to feel the weight of his hands, the hands they thought were too disciplined to touch. The physical toll was immense. He took a blade to the shoulder, the hot flare of pain a reminder that he was still made of flesh and blood. He felt the warm stickiness of his own life blooming through his shirt, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the warehouse. Finally, it was just him and Marco. The rival boss pulled a weapon, but Elias was faster, fueled by a primal need to protect the woman he loved. He disarmed the man with a sickening crack of bone, then drove him back against a rusted pillar. There was no mercy in Elias's eyes, only a cold, final judgment. He didn't kill the man for the territory or the money. He did it to clear the path for the man he was becoming. Once the silence returned to the granary, broken only by the distant moan of the wind, Elias stumbled toward Clara. His hands were shaking as he pulled a knife from his belt and sliced through her bonds. The moment she was free, she threw herself into his arms, her body a frantic, sobbing heat against his battered frame. Elias pulled her close, his head resting against her shoulder as the adrenaline began to ebb away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The physical contact was more than just a gesture of comfort. It was a reclamation. He felt the softness of her hair against his cheek, the rhythmic thrum of her heart echoing his own. Despite the blood on his shirt and the ache in his limbs, he had never felt more alive. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that was no longer a secret. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb grazing her lower lip. The air between them was saturated with the scent of jasmine and the metallic tang of the struggle they had survived. He leaned in, his lips finally meeting hers in a kiss that had been 8 years in the making. It was a slow, deep connection that tasted of salt and salvation. It was the breaking of the final seal, a physical surrender that signaled the end of his exile. The heat of her mouth was a revelation, a fire that burned away the last of the ice in his veins. In that moment, the gangster from the East End vanished, replaced by a man who had finally learned that true strength wasn't found in isolation, but in the courage to let someone in. They walked out of the granary together, the first hints of dawn beginning to grey the horizon. The snow was falling again, a soft white veil that seemed to wash the city clean of the night's violence. Elias leaned on Clara, his weight heavy but his heart light. He knew that the world would still have its challenges, and that his past wouldn't disappear overnight. But as they reached the car, he looked back at the dark silhouette of the warehouse and realized that the debt was finally paid. The city was waking up, the sound of the first buses and the distant hum of traffic signaling the start of a new day. Elias Thorne took a deep breath of the cold morning air, feeling the expansion of his lungs and the warmth of the woman at his side. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in nearly a decade he wasn't afraid to find out. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long golden fingers across the Thames, a new realization began to take root in his mind, a realization that would change everything about how he chose to live his life from this moment forward. The morning of April 22nd, 2024, arrived with a rare crystalline clarity that seemed to wash the soot from the London skyline. The city was bathed in a soft gold light that made the glass towers of the financial district shimmer like pillars of salt. In a quiet apartment overlooking a bend in the Thames, far from the blood-stained alleys of the East End, Elias Thorne stood on a balcony watching the world wake up. The air was cool and carried the scent of blooming lime trees and the distant, briny breath of the sea. Elias was no longer the man who had stood on that bridge in October 2022. The charcoal suits had been replaced by a simple dark sweater that clung to the hard lines of his shoulders. The flint grey of his eyes had softened, the icy barrier replaced by a quiet, observant depth. He carried a single scar on his shoulder, a jagged reminder of the granary. But it no longer felt like a mark of shame, it felt like a badge of survival. He had spent 8 years, 7 months, and 19 days in a prison of his own making, and the first breath of true freedom was sweeter than he had ever imagined. The heavy glass door behind him slid open, and the silence of the morning was broken by the soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps. Clara stepped onto the balcony, her presence immediately warming the space around him. She was wearing a silk robe the color of a stormy sea, her hair a wild, beautiful tangle of honeyed curls that caught the morning light. She didn't say a word, She simply moved into the space beside him, her body a familiar, comforting heat. Elias turned to her, his movements fluid and devoid of the tension that had once defined him. He reached out, his hand, now steady and sure, sliding around her waist to pull her close. The physical contact was no longer a shock to his system. It was a homecoming. He felt the incredible softness of the silk against his palms, and beneath it, the firm, yielding reality of her skin. He leaned down, his lips grazing the sensitive curve of her neck, inhaling the jasmine scent that had become the anchor of his new life. The sensuality of their connection had evolved from a desperate, frantic hunger into a deep, abiding intimacy. He spent a moment simply feeling the weight of her against him, the way her breathing synchronized with his own. He traced the line of her spine with his fingertips, a slow, deliberate movement that made her lean back into him with a soft sigh of contentment. There was no rush here, no looming shadows, and no debts left to pay. They had carved a sanctuary out of the chaos, a place where the only currency was the warmth they shared. They spent the morning in a slow, heated dance of domesticity. As they sat at the small wooden table, the sun pouring over them like liquid gold, Elias found himself reflecting on the man he used to be. He thought of the reckless prince of 2015 and the hollow king of 2022. He realized that his greatest mistake hadn't been the violence or the crime. It had been the belief that he could survive without being touched by the world. He had thought that by closing himself off, he was protecting himself and others, but he had only succeeded in becoming a ghost in his own life. Clara reached across the table, her fingers intertwining with his. She watched him with an expression that was both wise and deeply loving. She told him that the strength he had used to maintain his vow was the same strength that would allow him to build something meaningful now. She said that resilience wasn't about staying unbroken. It was about the courage to put the pieces back together in a new way. Elias looked at his hands, the hands that had dealt death and held onto a ghost for nearly a decade. They were the same hands, yet they felt entirely different. They were capable of building, of protecting, and most importantly, of feeling. He realized that the trauma of Sarah's death would always be a part of his story, but it was no longer the ending. The vow was a chapter that had finally closed, leaving the rest of the book blank and ready for a new narrative. As the day progressed, they walked through a nearby park, lost in the sea of people who knew nothing of the wars Elias had fought or the secrets he had kept. He felt a strange, beautiful sense of anonymity. He wasn't a legend or a monster. He was just a man walking with the woman he loved. Every brush of their shoulders, every shared glance, and every moment of casual contact was a celebration of the life he had almost thrown away. The evening brought a return to the quiet intimacy of their apartment. As the city lights began to twinkle below like a fallen galaxy, Elias and Clara stood together in the center of the room. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke from a small fire and the lingering warmth of the day. He pulled her against him, his hands sliding beneath the fabric of her robe to find the incredible silk-like heat of her back. The physical detail of their connection was an ongoing revelation. The way her skin felt against his palms, the rhythmic thrum of her heart against his chest, and the soft, inviting pressure of her lips as they met his. In the final, quiet moments of the day, as they lay together in the darkness, Elias Thorne felt a sense of peace that he had never known. He thought of the thousands of nights he had spent alone, staring at the ceiling and counting the seconds of his isolation. He thought of the fear that had been his only constant. It was gone now, replaced by a profound realization that the human spirit is capable of enduring almost anything if it has a reason to return to the light. The story of the London gangster who went years without touching a woman ended not with a bang, but with a breath. It was a story of a man who learned that true power isn't found in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to heal. As he drifted off to sleep, the warmth of Clara beside him acting as a shield against the cold of the world, Elias felt a surge of gratitude for the resilience of his own heart. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he also knew that he would never have to walk it alone again. The past was a memory, the future was a promise, and the present was a gift that he intended to cherish with every touch, every breath, and every heartbeat for the rest of his days.